So I wanted to introduce part two of understanding the system, and this is dependent arising. And this is getting into the heart, the most profound truths of the system. So there is this saying that I like. If you see dependent relationship, no ignorance will arise. And that is by Aryadeva. So if you see dependent relationship, no ignorance will arise. This truth of dependent relationship is the most profound kind of wisdom. And as we discussed in the previous section, wisdom is what opposes ignorance. It is through wisdom that we overcome ignorance. And so understanding this dependent relationship is extremely important. And so there's many types and examples and ways of showing and depicting dependent relationship, but I'll try to give a summary here. So I'll start by reminding us that the mind naturally thinks in terms of things. So we tend to think that there are these things out there that exist. Now, whenever our mind thinks of a thing, we do so by distinguishing it from all of the others, everything else that is not that thing. And so implicitly, whenever our mind conceives of something, we're distinguishing it from all the things that are not that thing, everything else. And in cognitive science, this is what's known as a figure-ground relationship. So you see this thing, and then implicitly, you see everything else that is, you see this thing simply by differentiating it from everything else. So if you look around your room, I see a lamp, for example. Now, what does that mean that I see a lamp? There's visual forms that are arising in my eyes are stimulated by something, but I see a lamp, and my mind is able to differentiate it from carpet, from wall, from desk, and so forth, from all of the things that are not that lamp. And that's basically how we navigate our world. I've got a glass of water, and I'm differentiating that from all the things that are not the glass. And this water, I can differentiate that from all the things that are not water. So for example, the water is different from the glass and so forth. So our mind basically is operating by making distinctions. This capability is known as discrimination. But when we do this, we're actually, our mind is going to an extreme. There is some profound misunderstanding that's happening in our mind when we think in this way. Because in fact, things do not exist on their own. They're actually produced from not that thing. So not that thing is actually what makes things up and what causes things. And without things that are not it, things would cease to exist. It's kind of getting very, very theoretical, I suppose. But if we take, for example, a sprout, it's a classic example. So a sprout can only exist in dependence upon a seed, for example. But really, the seed, it is a process that gives rise to this sprout. There is no point at which the seed, at one point is a seed, and then the next point it is a sprout. If you look at the very fine-grained moments in time, you can't distinguish one moment at which the seed totally ceases. There is a continuum, basically, where we are at one end of the spectrum calling it seed, and at another end of the spectrum, we're calling it sprout, but it is one unbroken continuum that we're basically making a distinction. And so I've got some visuals here. We take our seeds and sprouts. So at one point you're seeing a seed, chickpea or something like that, and when green starts to emerge from it, these greens are dependent related, right? They come from the seed. If the seed wasn't there, these could not come into existence. And so the seed is not something different from, the sprout is not something different from the seed, because the sprout, in fact, has come from the seed. You can give it a different name. It's fine if you want to distinguish it verbally, but the sprout is not something separate, different from the seed. Now, here's where it comes a lot closer to home. So if you think your body, for example, your body has actually come from your parents' bodies, and so it's not actually your own. Literally, in your body, the entirety of your body is like a sprout that has emerged from the seeds of your parents' germ cells, sperm and egg, and so forth. Their DNA, effectively. So you do not have any DNA of your own. Now that may sound a bit strange, shocking, but you do not have any DNA of your own. You only have your parents' DNA. And DNA comes from viruses and so forth that may have modified your genome, but you don't have any DNA of your own. And so if you don't have any DNA of your own, the body is not really truly your own. It is an outgrowth of the genetic foundations of humanity, which in turn are an outgrowth of the genetic foundations of life on Earth. And in this way, our body exists, but it only exists as a dependent related body on its causes. Now, things also exist in dependence upon their parts. And so if we take, for example, a sprout again. So this sprout, we have a tendency to think of it as just one thing, but actually the sprout is really just a collection of all of these cells, these tiny, tiny cells, right? And there are, innumerable of these cells. But basically, if you were to take these cells away, there is no sprout. So these cells that make up the sprout, for example, without them, there is no sprout. I mean, I could go on, of course, but basically, you see that the whole thing is just made of these smaller parts, these smaller subcomponents, and there is nothing that is the sprout itself. So whereas you thought that there was a sprout, when you look more closely, you see actually just a bunch of cells. There's nothing in here that actually is a sprout. You zoom in, it's all these individual cells in the plant, and each of those cells is basically an individual autonomous entity. Now that's true of all living things, plants and animals. It's true of all rocks. There are no mountains. Aside from mountains that are dependent related upon sand, grains, rocks, crystalline structures, and so forth. Everything exists, but only exists in dependence upon its parts. Nevertheless, we strongly identify a thing with nevertheless, we give something a name like sprout, and when we give it a name, we think of it as a whole entity, and we forget, for example, that it is actually made of all of these parts. So if you were to totally forget about the sprout as a solid entity, then you would only see all of these individual cells, but what our mind does is it treats this sprout as if it was a thing. And so when we're doing that, when we're thinking of the sprout as a thing, we are not seeing dependent relationship. We're not seeing how the sprout exists in dependence upon its parts. When we see it emerging from these parts, or recognize that the thing doesn't exist separate from its parts, that is seeing dependent relationship. And so that's what we mean when we say that a sprout exists in dependence upon its causes. Now, this is what is known as subtle dependent relationship. Is dependence on a thing's parts. So there are, in fact, three levels of dependent relationship. Subtle dependent relationship. There is gross dependent relationship, and that's depending on causes. So gross dependent relationship depending on causes, subtle dependent relationship depending on parts. And the most subtle kind of dependent relationship is what's known as very subtle dependent relationship. And very subtle dependent relationship specifically means dependent on imputation by mind. And this is what I was referring to, where sprout actually comes from the conception by mind of sprout. And this is what I'm getting at here when we realize the mind can see things in very different ways, either seeing the parts of something, for example, or seeing it as a whole. But what we are effectively doing is we're just giving it a name. So this process of naming, we have given a name to this, called it a sprout. At what point did it cease to be a seed? Well, that distinction is made by the mind, right? You could have continued to call the whole thing just chickpea, the whole thing, whether it's in the seed form or the sprout form, it's all one thing. Now, this is called very subtle dependent relationship. To realize how sprouts depend on imputation by mind, it's called very subtle dependent relationship because you can only really realize this once you've realized the other two kinds of dependent relationship. Only when you realize that seeds come from sprouts and sprouts depend on their parts and are just basically, then you realize that sprout is just a name that is given to the parts, and you realize that the sprout that you thought was a real thing was actually just the name sprout applied to a collection of things. But until you gain that realization, we think and behave as if the sprout is real. Now, let's come back to this analogy or this example of your body. And we can say, okay, our body clearly comes from our parents' bodies. But if we look more broadly at you, of course, in addition to your body, there are the mental parts of you, and we'll look more in detail at what the mental parts are. But you are made of countless parts, and that is just, by definition, that's how it works. Let me copy this one instead. This is, in fact, you. You are exactly the same as the sprout. There is a tendency to think that you are real, but let's see if I can. There's a tendency to think that you are real, but at the end of the day, you are just a collection of parts. There's all the physical parts, there's all the mental parts, thoughts, feelings, consciousness, intentions, behaviors, and so forth. And at some point we call this you, we give it this name, me. But actually, if you look, you can't find anything but parts. There's just the body, the physical parts, and then all the mental parts. And that is what we call dependent relationship depending on parts, subtle dependent relationship depending on parts. Now, you have arisen from causes. Now, your body clearly came from your parents' bodies. Your mind, you can say, whatever is the mind, comes from all kinds of sources, right? Others, ideas. There are, the minds arising from the senses. We can say consciousness and so forth arising from our different sense awarenesses, which is, sort of biologically generated. And basically, roughly speaking, our whole life is all of the awareness that comes through our senses. That's basically the stimulation of these sense organs, eyes, ears, and so forth. They can get stimulated and generate some kind of consciousness. And we've merged this experience of the senses with others' ideas, such as language. All of our verbal processing, all of our thinking, all of the conceptual thinking that we do is basically using somebody else's language. You didn't make this language up. You might have made up a few words in your life, but basically you inherited it. And so what you call your mind, all the stuff that I'm sharing here, the system, none of it is mine. It's all stuff that I received from my own teachers and so forth. But once I know something, I think, oh, I know this, and I remember this, and I feel that, and so forth. But we're basically just taking our own experience or taking the ideas and so forth that come from others, and we're giving it the label mind, but my knowledge is dependent related. So I have no knowledge of this subject or any subject that is not dependent related knowledge. And that's what we mean by the mind being dependent related. The body is dependent related. The mind and body are both dependent on parts. And this final point, very subtle dependent relationship by imputation by mind, this is where we're talking about you. And so this is what we mean, that the you are a concept that has been generated. Now, you have the idea that you're a person, a self. Your parents have the idea that you're a person, self. Humans, we all understand other humans, and we can all give this name and agree that that's, this is you and that's not you and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's all just names, imputation by mind. But you can't really realize that until you realize these first two, that the way in which body and mind have come from causes, and that also they depend upon parts. So this is subtle stuff. You have to contemplate this a lot, and you have to check your own experience carefully, but hopefully that is a helpful introduction, and then I can get into more details here in a minute.